close your eyes. In May 2023, the CEO of Multichain, one of DeFi's most widely used cross-chain bridges, no announcement, no explanation. Then $126 million began draining from the protocol's contracts in irregular transfers. Blockchain analysts tracked it in real time. Nobody could stop it. Nobody could explain it. The man who held the keys was gone, and so eventually was the money. Imagine waking up one morning to find that a bridge has disappeared. Not a physical bridge, a digital one. A bridge that hundreds of thousands of people had used to move their crypto assets between different blockchains, that had processed hundreds of billions of dollars in transaction volume over its 3 years of operation. That was one of the most widely used pieces of infrastructure in the entire DeFi ecosystem. And the bridge has not simply stopped working. It has stopped working in a way that nobody, not its users, not the protocols that depended on it, not the broader DeFi community, can explain, because the person who could explain it has also disappeared. This is what happened in May 2023 to a protocol called Multichain, known by its previous name as Anyswap. The CEO of the company behind the protocol, a Chinese national known in the industry by his name Zhao Jun, had not published anything on social media in several weeks. The development team had stopped communicating. The website had gone silent. And then, beginning in late May and accelerating through June and July 2023, large quantities of funds began flowing out of the protocol's bridge contracts, moving to addresses that had no obvious connection to the protocol's normal operations, in patterns that did not resemble any scheduled maintenance or planned migration. The total drained was approximately $126 million, taken from the Phantom, Moonriver, and Dogecoin chains in a series of large, irregular transfers that blockchain analysts tracked in real time with growing alarm. And at the center of the mystery was the question that nobody has definitively answered to this day. What happened to Zhao Jun, who disappeared with the private keys that controlled those funds, and whether what occurred was a hack, a rug pull, a government seizure, or something stranger still? The multi-chain case is, in many ways, a pure distillation of a risk that had been present in the DeFi ecosystem since its earliest days, but had rarely been so clearly illustrated. The risk that decentralized financial infrastructure, despite its technological architecture, remains dependent on particular human beings in ways that create profound vulnerabilities when those human beings become unavailable. Every DeFi protocol that uses private keys to manage critical functions has this dependency at its core. Most of the time, the dependency is invisible because nothing goes wrong. When something does go wrong, when the key holder is detained or incapacitated or simply gone, the vulnerability becomes visible in the most costly possible way. The story of Multichain's collapse is also a story about the precise geopolitical risk dimension of a global industry whose builders are not globally distributed in proportion to its users. A large fraction of the talent, capital, and operational infrastructure of DeFi has been concentrated in China, Hong Kong, and other parts of East Asia, where regulatory environments differ substantially from Western standards and where government action can be swift, opaque, and irreversible. This concentration created a risk that was known in the abstract, discussed in security research, noted in risk assessments, but that had not been adequately operationalized into the architectural decisions of many protocols that depended on Chinese-operated infrastructure. Multichain was one of the most widely used protocols in DeFi at the time of its collapse. It had processed more cumulative transaction volume than most of its bridge competitors. Its disappearance created disruption that extended far beyond the direct losses from the drain, affecting dozens of protocols that had built their cross-chain functionality around Multichain's infrastructure and now face the challenge of migrating to alternatives under time pressure. with uncertain information about the state of their multi-chain connected assets. What makes the multi-chain story worth examining in detail is not that it was the largest DeFi failure. It was not, measured in dollars. The Ronin hack, the FTX collapse, and the Terra implosion all involved larger amounts. What makes it worth examining is the category of failure it represents. Not a code vulnerability, not a fraud, not a market mechanism gone wrong, but a human availability problem in infrastructure that had presented itself as trustless. The DeFi ecosystem had built elaborate systems to eliminate the need for trust in code and in market mechanisms, and then had placed those systems in the hands of founders whose personal availability was a critical and fragile dependency. Understanding how that happened and what it implies for the infrastructure that hundreds of millions of dollars flow through today is the purpose of the story that follows. In the next chapter, how multi-chain grew from the Anyswap protocol into DeFi's most widely used cross-chain bridge, the MPC key management architecture, and the concentration of operational control that would make a single founder's disappearance an existential crisis for hundreds of millions in user assets. Multichain, originally launched in 2020 under the name Anyswap, was one of the first and largest cross-chain bridge protocols in DeFi. A bridge, in the DeFi context, is infrastructure that allows assets to move between different blockchain networks. Moving assets from Ethereum to Phantom, or from Binance Smart Chain to Avalanche, requires a protocol that can lock tokens on the origin chain and mint equivalent representations on the destination chain. And that can be trusted to hold the locked tokens securely while facilitating the movement. Bridges are, by their nature, high-value targets. The largest bridge hacks in DeFi history, the Ronin network hack, the wormhole hack, the Nomad hack, all targeted bridge infrastructure because bridges concentrate custody of large quantities of assets in smart contracts or in multi-sig wallets controlled by a small number of private keys. The security model of a bridge is only as strong as the security of the keys that control it, and the operational security of those keys is only as strong as the practices of the people who hold them. Multichain had grown to become one of the largest bridges in DeFi. At its peak in 2022, the protocol was facilitating tens of billions of dollars in monthly transaction volume across dozens of blockchain networks. It had partnerships with a large number of DeFi protocols, projects that used multi-chain infrastructure to allow their users to move assets between chains. Protocols like Phantom, which relied heavily on multi-chain as its primary bridge to Ethereum, were deeply dependent on the protocol's continued functioning. The protocol was operated by a company that had offices, or at least registered presences, in multiple jurisdictions, but whose actual operations were concentrated in China and were managed primarily by Zhao Jun, whose full name was He Yilong. Zhao Jun had built Anyswap from scratch and remained, through its growth into Multichain, the central technical authority and the primary holder of the private keys that controlled the protocol's most sensitive functions. This concentration of key management in a single individual was a known architectural vulnerability. Bridge security researchers and DeFi analysts had, over the preceding years, repeatedly raised concerns about the security model of protocols that relied on a small number of individuals, or in the worst case, a single individual, to manage the private keys that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in user assets. The standard recommendation was multi-sig arrangements that required consensus among multiple independent key holders before any major action could be taken. Multichain had some multi-sig structure, but the most critical keys remained under centralized control. Cross-chain bridge infrastructure represents one of the most difficult security problems in DeFi, for reasons that go beyond simply securing a smart contract. A bridge must, by definition, maintain state across multiple blockchains, locking assets on one chain and minting representations on another. This cross-chain coordination cannot be fully automated through smart contracts alone. Some entity must verify that the lock on one chain has occurred before the mint on another chain is authorized, and the entity that performs this verification is a point of trust. Fully trustless bridges, using cryptographic proofs to verify cross-chain state without any trusted intermediary, are technically feasible but computationally expensive, and in 2023 were still being developed and deployed. Most deployed bridges, including Multichain, relied on trusted intermediary models that required some human or organizational layer to perform verification functions. Multichain's model used a network of multi-party computation nodes, a distributed key management scheme in which no single party held a complete private key, but multiple parties had shares of keys that required threshold coordination to produce a valid signature. This was more sophisticated than a single private key and represented a genuine attempt at distributing key management. But the MPC scheme still required the participation of operational nodes that were controlled and managed by the Multichain team. And the Multichain team's central operational authority remained concentrated around Zhaojun. The protocol had grown faster than its security infrastructure had evolved. At its peak in 2022, when DeFi transaction volumes were at their highest and cross-chain activity was growing rapidly, Multichain had expanded its support for new chains and new assets at a pace that required operational decisions to be made quickly. The tension between rapid expansion and rigorous security architecture is one of the most common sources of vulnerability in DeFi, and Multichain was not unique in allowing that tension to resolve in favor of growth over security. What was unusual was the nature of the vulnerability that resulted, not a code bug, but a human and institutional dependency that only became visible when the humans involved became unavailable. The history of cross-chain bridge security before Multichain was a sequence of increasingly large failures, each of which had demonstrated a different facet of the challenge. The Ronin network hack in March 2022, $600 million drained by an attacker who compromised the validator keys of the Ronin chain, showed what happened when multisig thresholds were set too low and key holders were insufficiently secured. The wormhole hack in February 2022, $300 million extracted through a smart contract signature verification bug, showed what happened when the code itself contained exploitable logic errors. The Nomad hack in August 2022, $190 million drained in a chaotic free-for-all after a single initial exploit enabled an open attack, showed what happened when upgrade procedures introduced vulnerabilities that were then quickly exploited by hundreds of independent actors. Each failure taught the bridge industry something. None of them had taught the lesson that Multichain would eventually illustrate, that the founder's personal availability was a critical single point of failure. Multichain's market position at the time of its collapse reflected its genuine technical contribution. It had solved real engineering problems, supporting a wide variety of blockchain networks with different virtual machine architectures, maintaining consistent behavior across chains with different finality characteristics, and providing the liquidity depth that made large cross-chain transfers practical. The protocols that had built on multi-chain infrastructure had done so because multi-chain worked reliably and had competitive fees and liquidity. The decision to use multi-chain was reasonable given the information available when those decisions were made, which is precisely what makes the collapse so difficult to retrospectively evaluate. The error was not obvious from the outside. It was only visible in hindsight after the failure mode that the architecture contained had actually triggered. The first public signs that something was wrong with Multichain appeared in late May 2023. The protocol's social media accounts went quiet. Routine updates that had appeared regularly stopped appearing. Questions from users and protocol teams that depended on Multichain's infrastructure went unanswered. In the DeFi community, these are not trivially alarming signals. Development teams go quiet during intensive work periods. Founders take breaks. The first days of silence did not trigger immediate panic. But as the silence extended through 1 week, then 2, concern began to mount in the communities most exposed to Multichain's functioning. The Phantom Foundation, which had built much of its ecosystem's cross-chain connectivity around Multichain, reached out repeatedly for information and received no substantive response. The protocols that had integrated Multichain as bridge infrastructure found themselves unable to get answers about the state of the system they depended on. The on-chain data was still visible. The bridge contracts were still holding the assets, but the operational team was unreachable. In late May, reports began to emerge through Chinese-language crypto media, sources that were not widely followed in the Western DeFi community, but that had connections to the Chinese blockchain industry, that Zhao Jun and other members of the Multichain team had been detained by Chinese authorities. The reports were unconfirmed and difficult to verify. Multichain issued no statement confirming or denying them. The Chinese authorities did not publicly acknowledge any action. If the reports were accurate, the operational implications were severe. Multichain's architecture meant that the private keys necessary to manage the bridge contracts, to upgrade the smart contracts if necessary, and to access the custodied funds were held by individuals who were now, apparently, in custody and unable to exercise their key management responsibilities. The protocol was, in effect, headless. The infrastructure was running, the contracts were holding funds, but the people with administrative access were unavailable. This is a failure mode of centralized key management that security researchers had theorized about, but that had rarely been demonstrated in practice at this scale. A DeFi protocol whose operations are genuinely decentralized, distributed across many independent nodes or key holders, can survive the absence or incapacitation of any single person. A protocol whose operations depend on keys held by 1 or 2 individuals cannot. The week-by-week deterioration of confidence in Multichain through May 2023 traced the distinct way that information vacuums function in the crypto space. With no official statement from the team, the community filled the information gap with a combination of on-chain data analysis, rumor, and speculation. Blockchain explorers showed the contracts still holding assets. Twitter and Telegram channels showed growing anxiety and conflicting theories. The protocols and DeFi teams that depended on Multichain were making risk management decisions in real time on the basis of incomplete and unverified information. For the Phantom Foundation, which had made Multichain the centerpiece of its cross-chain connectivity, the silence was particularly devastating. Phantom had bet its ecosystem's cross-chain functionality on a single bridge provider, and that provider was now unreachable. The architectural dependency that had been efficient during normal operation, one bridge, one team, streamlined integration, had become a single point of failure at the worst possible moment. The Phantom Foundation's public communications during this period were careful and informative, but they could not fill the fundamental gap. Nobody outside the Multichain team had the ability to fix the technical problem, and the Multichain team was not available. The silence also created a particular problem for users trying to make individual decisions about their own assets. The canonical advice in DeFi, if a protocol is behaving unexpectedly, withdraw your assets immediately, presupposes that withdrawal is possible. For users with assets in mid-bridge transit or in liquidity pools on Multichain's platform, withdrawal was not possible through the normal interface. The only assets that users could withdraw were those fully on chains where multi-chains contracts were still accessible, and many users' assets were precisely the ones that could not be readily accessed. The people who were most urgently advised to protect themselves were, in many cases, the people least able to act on that advice. The difference between how the Phantom Foundation communicated during the multi-chain crisis and how the multi-chain team itself communicated illustrates the broader challenge of decentralized ecosystem management. Phantom, as a protocol ecosystem that was highly exposed to multi-chain, but was not the same entity as multi-chain, could publish updates acknowledging the problem, advising users on available actions, and describing the steps the Foundation was taking to understand and mitigate the situation. It could be transparent without being able to fix the underlying problem. Multichain, as the entity whose team members were apparently detained, could publish nothing, because the people who would have published were unavailable, and the remaining team members were in a position of profound legal and operational uncertainty that made any public statement a potential liability. The silence was not indifference. It was, in all probability, a reflection of a situation in which normal operational and communications functions had been disabled along with the key management functions. The protocols that had multi-chain integrations but were not Phantom faced a different kind of challenge. They were third parties whose products had been built using multi-chain infrastructure as a dependency, and they now had to decide how urgently to communicate with their own users about the multi-chain situation. Early and transparent communication was the ethical choice, but it also meant acknowledging that their products had a dependency on infrastructure whose status was unknown, a disclosure that some teams made more readily than others. The multi-chain situation was an indirect but meaningful test of how DeFi protocols handled their responsibilities to their users when third-party infrastructure failed. Some passed that test well. Others communicated late, minimized the risk in their messaging, or waited for more certainty before alerting users who had assets at risk. Beginning in late May and continuing through July 2023, funds began moving out of multi-chain's bridge contracts. The movements were not consistent with any normal operational pattern. Large quantities of assets, wrapped tokens, stablecoins, various cryptocurrencies, moved from the bridge contracts to addresses that had no obvious connection to multi-chain's documented treasury or operational wallets. The amounts were substantial, approximately $67 million from Phantom, about $57 million from Moonriver, and smaller amounts from other chains, totaling approximately $126 million across all the affected contracts. The movements were not instantaneous. They occurred in multiple transactions across several weeks, which is itself somewhat puzzling from the perspective of someone executing a deliberate hack or exit, who would typically move funds as quickly and comprehensively as possible. Blockchain analysts at Chainalysis, Nansen, and PeckShield tracked the movements in real time and published analyses noting the unusual patterns. The funds were not immediately moved through mixing services or cross-chain protocols to obscure their origin. They sat in the destination wallets in a way that was fully visible and traceable on-chain. This was unusual behavior for a sophisticated external hacker, who would typically have implemented at least some obfuscation. It was more consistent with someone who had access to the keys, but was operating under unusual constraints, perhaps someone in custody, or someone under legal or personal pressure, or someone managing the situation in a way that went beyond any simple categorization. The Phantom Foundation, in a statement published in June 2023, described the situation as a personal custody issue. Its language suggested awareness of the detention reports and urged users to withdraw assets from the protocol as quickly as possible. Protocols across DeFi that had multi-chain integrations suspended those integrations or urged their users to bridge assets out through alternative providers. The DeFi ecosystem moved into a defensive posture around multi-chain connected assets. The on-chain analysis of the drain transactions produced some of the more detailed blockchain forensics of the period. Analysts at Nansen and Chainalysis published breakdowns of the transaction sequences, identifying the targeted contract interactions through which the assets were extracted and the wallet addresses to which they were sent. The analysis revealed that the extraction was not a clean, technically sophisticated sweep, the kind of operation a skilled external hacker would typically execute, but a series of manual-seeming transactions that used the bridge contract's administrative functions in ways that required access to particular privileged keys. This pattern was consistent with a scenario in which someone with legitimate administrative access, someone who had the keys, was performing the extractions. Whether that someone was Zhaojun acting under duress, Zhaojun acting on his own initiative before detention, Chinese authorities who had obtained key material, or some other actor who had gained access through means not yet identified, was not determinable from the on-chain data alone. The transactions told you what happened. They could not tell you who directed them or under what circumstances the decisions were made. The irregular timing of the extractions, spread across weeks rather than hours, was one of the more puzzling aspects of the situation. A deliberate rug pull, executed by a competent technical team that had decided to exit, would typically move funds as quickly and comprehensively as possible, minimizing the time window during which detection and intervention were possible. The slow, partial extractions over weeks suggested either that the person making decisions was operating under constraints, limited access to keys, limited time, competing priorities, or that the extractions were not being directed by a single actor, but by multiple parties with different access levels and objectives. The uncertainty about which of these scenarios was closer to accurate defined much of the multi-chain mystery's enduring quality. The composition of the drained assets, wrapped versions of USDC, USDT, DAI, WBTC, ETH, and various smaller tokens, reflected the contents of multi-chain's bridge reserves on the affected chains. Bridges hold reserves of the assets they enable transfers of. Users deposit on one chain, the bridge holds those deposits, and mints equivalent representations on the destination chain. The reserves that Phantom's multi-chain bridge held were largely the assets that had been deposited by users over its years of operation, plus the liquidity that had been deployed by liquidity providers seeking yield from bridge fees. The drain took assets that real people had entrusted to the bridge for real purposes: cross-chain transfers, yield generation, portfolio management, and moved them to wallets whose controllers had not earned or been authorized to receive them. The human dimension of that process is easily lost in the forensics. Each transaction was a number on a blockchain explorer. Collectively, they represented the savings, investment positions, and working capital of hundreds or thousands of individuals who had made reasonable decisions to use infrastructure that had worked reliably for years before it did not. The abstract language of funds drained and exploited contracts is accurate but insufficient. Behind those numbers were people who had trusted a system and been failed by the layer of human decision-making that the system's architecture had placed above the trustless ledger it was built on. For the users who had assets locked in multi-chain's bridge contracts at the time the protocol stopped functioning, people who had deposited assets to bridge between chains and had not yet completed their transfers, the situation was acutely stressful. Their funds were visible on-chain, in contracts that were clearly holding them, but there was no functioning interface to complete the withdrawal, no operational team to contact for assistance, and no timeline for resolution. Some of these users had been waiting for bridge completions when the protocol went silent. Others had funds in Multichain's liquidity pools, earning yield as liquidity providers. Still others had received Multichain's bridge token representations, wrapped assets that were nominally equivalent to their underlying counterparts, but whose redeemability had become uncertain. For all of these users, the question of whether and when they would recover their funds was entirely unclear. The experience of watching your funds sit visibly on-chain in a contract you cannot access is a particular kind of financial limbo that has no close analog in traditional finance. In a bank failure, your deposits become a claim in a bankruptcy proceeding. There is a legal structure, however slow and imperfect, that acknowledges your position and processes it towards some resolution. In the multi-chain situation, there was no proceeding. The contracts were running, the funds were there, they just could not be reached. Users who refreshed their wallet interfaces could see their positions, denominated in numbers that had once been reliable measures of value, and do nothing to change them. The helplessness was not the helplessness of loss. The funds had not, technically, moved into anyone else's hands yet at the start of the crisis. It was the helplessness of suspension. Everything frozen, everything visible, nothing accessible. The DeFi community's response combined genuine solidarity with the pragmatic self-interest of protocols that needed to address their own exposure. Several bridge providers, Layer 0, Stargate, DeBridge, saw dramatic increases in their transaction volumes as users migrated away from multi-chain. The competitive landscape of bridge infrastructure, which multi-chain had dominated, shifted rapidly. Efforts by various parties to access the multi-chain contracts and either return funds to users or migrate them to a safer state ran into the fundamental obstacle. The private keys that would be needed to execute such operations were with Zhaojun, and Zhaojun was inaccessible. Some contracts had multi-sig arrangements that, in theory, could allow action without Zhaojun's involvement, but getting the remaining key holders to coordinate in the context of an ongoing apparent legal situation in China proved difficult. Phantom eventually passed a governance vote to create a compensation mechanism for users who had lost funds connected to multi-chain's collapse, using treasury resources to provide partial restitution. This was an unusual step. Blockchain protocols don't typically compensate for the failures of third-party infrastructure they chose to depend on. That reflected the scale of Phantom's exposure and the disproportionate impact on its ecosystem. The texture of those weeks in the multi-chain user community had a particular quality that is difficult to convey without having lived through it. Crypto Twitter and the major Discord and Telegram channels hosting affected users were simultaneously sources of useful on-chain data analysis and conduits for misinformation. People were making consequential financial decisions. Whether to sell their wrapped token representations at a discount rather than wait for resolution. Whether to remain in multi-chain liquidity pools, hoping for normal operations to resume. Whether to attempt manual contract interactions that carried their own risks, with information that was incomplete, unverified, and rapidly changing. The emotional valence was distinct from the community response to a standard hack. In a hack, there is a clear villain and a clear event. Here there was ambiguity that made every day feel like a waiting room with no posted schedule. The question of what wrapped multi-chain assets were actually worth during the limbo period created a shadow market of sorts. Some DeFi protocols whose tokens had multi-chain bridged versions on other chains found those representations trading at substantial discounts to the native token. The market pricing and the possibility that redemption might never be possible. Users who held these bridged representations had to decide whether to accept a loss by selling at discount or hold and hope for resolution. Either choice could have been right, depending on how the situation resolved. The irreducible uncertainty of the period meant that whatever decision users made, they were not making it on the basis of adequate information. The migration of users and transaction volume to alternative bridges during the multi-chain crisis gave an inadvertent demonstration of the DeFi ecosystem's resilience, even as it demonstrated the ecosystem's dependence on trusted infrastructure. Layer 0, Stargate, Hop Protocol, and DeBridge all saw their transaction volumes increase significantly in the weeks following the multi-chain silence. For users who had assets fully on a single chain and simply wanted to stop using multi-chain connected infrastructure, the switch to an alternative was straightforward. For users with assets mid-bridge or in multi-chain operated liquidity pools, the alternatives were beside the point. They needed resolution of the multi-chain situation, not a different bridge to use going forward. The asymmetry meant that the users with the least exposure were easiest to migrate and had the most choices, while the users with the highest exposure remained trapped regardless of what alternatives emerged. The protocols that had built their products on multi-chain's infrastructure faced a different version of the same problem. Migrating cross-chain functionality from one bridge to another is not a simple swap. It requires smart contract changes, user migration, coordination with the new bridge provider, and in some cases, changes to the token contracts or liquidity pool structures that users had assets in. Protocols that had deeply integrated multi-chain were doing this migration while managing ongoing uncertainty about the state of their multi-chain connected assets, balancing urgency against the operational complexity of a non-trivial infrastructure change. Some moved quickly and incurred technical debt in the rush. Others moved carefully and left their users exposed to multi-chain's uncertainty longer than they would have preferred. The backdrop to the multi-chain situation was the deliberate regulatory environment in China toward cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency-related businesses. China had banned cryptocurrency trading and mining in 2021, a sweeping set of measures that had forced Chinese crypto businesses to relocate or restructure and had driven Chinese miners to other countries. The ban had not, however, ended Chinese participation in the global crypto industry. Chinese founders continued to operate protocols with global reach, and Chinese authorities continued to take an interest in the activities of crypto companies with Chinese connections. The detention of crypto founders and operators by Chinese authorities, typically for investigations related to financial crimes, money laundering, or fraud under Chinese law, had become a recurring pattern in the industry. Some detentions were disclosed publicly and resulted in charges and trials. Others occurred in a legal and informational gray zone, with families and colleagues unable to get information about the detainee's status, and the authorities declining to confirm or deny the detention. The lack of official confirmation in the multi-chain case, combined with the protocol's inability to communicate about what was happening, created a situation where speculation filled the vacuum. The theory that Zhaojun had been detained was the most widely circulated explanation, and the one that was most consistent with the available evidence. But it was not the only theory. Some analysts speculated that Zhaojun had conducted a deliberate rug pull, using the confusion of the apparent detention story as cover for an intentional exit with protocol funds. Others suggested that the protocol had been compromised by an external hacker who had obtained the keys through an unknown method and was draining funds gradually to avoid triggering immediate detection. None of these theories could be confirmed with public information. The on-chain data was fully visible, but interpreting it required knowing who controlled the wallets receiving the funds, and that information was not publicly available. The analytical firms tracking the situation could describe what the funds did, where they moved, when, in what quantities, but not definitively who directed them to move. The broader pattern of Chinese government action in the cryptocurrency space in 2021 through 2023 is important context for understanding why the detention theory carried credibility in the multi-chain community. Between the comprehensive 2021 mining and trading ban and the beginning of multi-chain's crisis, multiple founders and operators of Chinese-connected crypto businesses had faced legal action under Chinese law, typically for violations of the prohibition on providing cryptocurrency trading services to Chinese citizens, or for financial crimes investigations that touched on money flow through crypto channels. Some of these cases became public. Others were known only to the affected parties and their networks, becoming visible to the broader industry only through the sudden disappearance of a founder from social media. The legal mechanisms available to Chinese authorities in these situations were, by Western standards, opaque and broad. Administrative detention, temporary detention for investigation, without the immediate filing of formal charges, was a tool that Chinese police could deploy for extended periods before a case moved to formal prosecution. The individuals detained were often, during the administrative detention phase, unable to communicate freely with outside parties. Families were sometimes not immediately informed of the detention. The combination of opacity and speed that Chinese enforcement could deploy meant that the visible signal of a founder's disappearance often preceded any official acknowledgement by weeks or months. The concentration of DeFi's operational infrastructure in Chinese-controlled entities had developed partly because of the talent concentration and partly because of the capital availability in that market during the years of rapid DeFi growth. For much of 2020 and 2021, Chinese investors and builders were significant forces in DeFi, not exclusively but disproportionately relative to their share of the global crypto user base. This concentration was known and discussed in the industry, but it was typically discussed in terms of market dynamics and regulatory exposure, rather than in terms of the operational risk it created for non-Chinese users whose assets were custodied by Chinese-operated systems. The multi-chain situation surfaced a risk that had been acknowledged in principle but not adequately operationalized. If a DeFi protocol's key management is concentrated in a single jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction has enforcement tools that can effectively disable key management without transparency or notice, then users in every other jurisdiction who interact with that protocol are bearing the geopolitical risk of that jurisdiction without the protection afforded to citizens of that jurisdiction. American or European users of multi-chain had no way to hedge against the possibility that Chinese authorities would take action that would strand their assets, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had used infrastructure that turned out to have a jurisdictional concentration risk they had not fully priced. The difficulty for Chinese founders and operators in this environment was real and should not be elided. Building globally successful DeFi infrastructure while navigating China's regulatory environment, where the legal status of cryptocurrency-related activities shifted dramatically between 2021 and 2023, was a genuine challenge. Founders who had started building under one regulatory regime found their operations potentially illegal under the new one, without any clear path to legitimization. The legal risk they carried was not purely the result of choices they had made. It was also the result of regulatory change that happened around them after their products were built. The multi-chain case is a tragedy in multiple registers. For the users who lost money, for the developers who built something genuinely useful, and for a founder whose fate was, as of the time of writing, still not fully public. The geopolitical dimension of the multi-chain collapse generated a conversation in the DeFi community that had previously been largely avoided, about the responsibilities of protocols to their users when those protocols are operated by teams in jurisdictions with enforcement powers that could disable key management without notice or recourse. The conversation was uncomfortable because it had no clean resolution. Excluding or penalizing founders from particular jurisdictions would be discriminatory and would remove from the ecosystem some of its most capable builders. Ignoring the jurisdictional risk created by concentration was, as Multichain demonstrated, an error with concrete costs. The honest position, acknowledging the risk, demanding architectural mitigations, and recognizing that the architecture must be robust enough to tolerate the worst case, even when the people involved are doing everything right, required a maturity in thinking about infrastructure security that the DeFi community had not consistently maintained in its earlier, faster growth phases. The information asymmetry between Western and Eastern reporting on the multi-chain situation also exposed a structural gap in the DeFi community's situational awareness. The reports that Zhaojun had been detained emerged primarily through Chinese-language crypto media and informal networks that were not closely followed by English-language DeFi participants. By the time those reports were widely circulated in English-language channels, significant time had passed. Protocols that might have taken earlier defensive action had they received the information sooner were operating on outdated assumptions. The DeFi ecosystem, for all its aspiration to global borderless operation, was in practice informationally fragmented along linguistic and regional lines, a fragmentation that had real consequences when critical information about the state of shared infrastructure was emerging primarily from one region's reporting channels. In 2024, partial clarity emerged when Chinese authorities apparently concluded their investigation, and some information about what had happened became available through unofficial channels. Reports suggested that Zhaojun had indeed been detained by Chinese police, that the detention had been related to the operation of an unlicensed financial services business under Chinese law, and that some portion of the protocol's funds had been seized by the authorities in connection with the investigation. Multichain's founder's sister, who had also been involved with the protocol, provided a statement that gave the most comprehensive public account of the situation. According to her statement, Zhaojun had been taken away by Chinese police in May 2023. The funds that had moved out of the bridge contracts in the subsequent months, the $126 million that the DeFi community had watched drain in real time, included both funds moved by Zhaojun under unknown circumstances before his detention, and funds that had been seized or controlled by the authorities in the course of their investigation. The statement, while providing more information than had been publicly available, did not resolve all the significant questions. It was not clear how much of the drained funds had been voluntarily moved by Zhaojun before his detention, how much had been moved under duress or at the direction of authorities, and how much remained under control of entities that might eventually make users whole. The legal process in China was not transparent in ways that would have allowed independent verification of the account provided. Law enforcement agencies in multiple other jurisdictions, the United States, various European countries, Singapore, received reports about the multi-chain situation and opened inquiries, but the primary conduct appeared to have occurred in China, and the individuals most directly involved were in China, which limited the effective reach of those inquiries. The users who had lost funds remained in an uncertain position. The DeFi legal landscape for recovering funds lost to bridge protocol failures, through whatever combination of hack, exit, and government action had occurred at Multichain, was essentially non-existent. The smart contracts had operated, funds had moved, the people responsible for managing them were either detained or otherwise unreachable. Recovery was uncertain. Behind every line of that legal abstraction is a person. Someone who used Multichain because it worked reliably for years. Someone who, on an ordinary morning in May 2023, had assets in mid-transit or locked in a liquidity pool. Someone who refreshed their wallet interface for weeks hoping the situation would resolve, followed the updates from blockchain analysts and the Phantom Foundation, made the hard decision at some point to write the number down as a loss, and then tried to figure out what came next. The legal framework cannot describe the experience of that person with any precision. It can only describe, inadequately, the absence of the mechanisms that would have provided them recourse. The sister's statement, published in mid-2024, was one of the most detailed first-person accounts of a major DeFi protocol failure to emerge from within the affected team. She described a timeline in which Zhaojun had been approached, then detained, then held through a process that unfolded in ways that did not provide the operational continuity that Multichain's key management required. Her account described how she and other team members had attempted to manage the protocol's situation in the absence of Zhaojun's involvement, had been unable to take certain actions because the keys required were under Zhaojun's control, and had eventually been unable to prevent the drain of funds that the world watched in real time. The statement was widely read in the DeFi community and accepted as broadly credible, but it remained an interested party's account in a situation where the full evidentiary record was not available. Chinese legal proceedings of this type do not produce publicly accessible court documents in the way that American or European proceedings do. The status of the investigation, the detailed charges, if any, and the disposition of the seized or drained assets remained matters of inference and report rather than documented fact. For affected users who needed that information to assess their legal options, the opacity was an additional obstacle layered on top of the already limited DeFi legal landscape. The cross-border legal challenges in the Multichain case illustrated a genuine gap in the international legal infrastructure for handling DeFi disputes. Mutual legal assistance treaties, the formal mechanisms through which one country can request evidentiary cooperation from another in criminal investigations, are slow, politically mediated, and not designed for the speed at which blockchain-related financial crimes occur. American or European law enforcement that wanted to obtain information about the multi-chain situation from Chinese authorities faced the standard MLAT timelines, which measure in months or years, applied to a situation where the relevant evidence was largely on-chain, and the resolution of users' claims depended on information that the Chinese proceedings controlled. Some affected users pursued civil legal options in their home jurisdictions, filing reports with financial regulators, initiating small claims processes where applicable, joining informal coordination groups, exploring the possibility of class action litigation. These efforts were well-intentioned, but faced a fundamental obstacle. The primary conduct occurred in China. The assets were on blockchains whose smart contracts were legally ownerless, and the entities against whom any judgment would be enforced were either in Chinese custody or otherwise beyond effective reach. The blockchain's transparency, the immutable record of every transaction, provided rich evidence for the forensic analysis of what had happened. It provided much less leverage for the legal recovery of what was lost. Multichain's collapse produced a rapid and significant re-examination of bridge security across DeFi. The defined vulnerability that had contributed to the disaster, private key concentration in a small number of individuals, was a known risk that the industry had discussed in theory, but had not, in many cases, addressed in practice. In the months following the multi-chain collapse, multiple bridge protocols published detailed disclosures of their key management architectures, describing the multi-sig arrangements, the geographic distribution of key holders, and the minimum thresholds for transaction approval. The standard that emerged from community discussion was considerably more conservative than what had been acceptable before multi-chain. Not just multisig, but multisig with key holders distributed across multiple jurisdictions, with no single jurisdiction having majority control, and with hardware security module requirements for the storage of those keys. Several protocols also moved toward architectures that reduced or eliminated the need for trusted key management altogether, relying instead on cryptographic proofs, zero-knowledge proofs, optimistic proofs, that allowed bridge operations to be verified without any party needing to hold custody of user funds. These approaches, while technically more complex, provided security guarantees that did not depend on any individual's ongoing availability or honesty. The cross-chain bridge space had been the site of DeFi's largest hacks before multi-chain. The Ronin hack, the wormhole hack, the Nomad hack had all been dramatically larger in dollar terms. Multi-chain added to this record and added a new category of failure. Not an external hacker who found a technical vulnerability, not an insider who planned a deliberate theft, but a founder's disappearance, creating a governance vacuum that no one had prepared for. The industry drew a hard lesson. DeFi infrastructure that depends on the continued availability of particular individuals is not, in any meaningful sense, decentralized infrastructure. The decentralization that matters is not the decentralization of the ledger. Bitcoin and Ethereum had solved that problem. But the decentralization of the people who hold the keys to the systems built on top of those ledgers. And that decentralization requires deliberate architectural choices, not just philosophical commitment. The protocols that made architectural changes in response to the multi-chain collapse tended to converge on a few core principles. First, no single jurisdiction should control a majority of the keys in any multi-sig threshold arrangement. Ideally, the key holders should span multiple different legal systems such that no single government's enforcement actions can disable the threshold. Second, the minimum threshold for a valid transaction should be set high enough that a minority of key holders acting under duress or coercion cannot unilaterally drain a protocol. Third, the hardware and operational security of key holders should meet standards that make key compromise through non-legal means, theft, hacking, social engineering, substantially more difficult than it had been under many protocols' previous practices. These principles were not new to DeFi security researchers. The novelty was that they moved from advisory recommendations in security audits to near requirements in the market's expectations. Protocols that could not demonstrate multi-jurisdictional key distribution faced user skepticism and media scrutiny in ways they had not previously. The market's expectations of bridge infrastructure shifted, not to perfection, but to a higher minimum standard of key management, transparency, and geographic distribution. The longer-term architectural shift was toward bridge models that required less trust in key holders by design. Zero-knowledge proof bridges, which used cryptographic proofs to verify cross-chain state without any trusted intermediary needing to hold custody, were in active development across multiple teams and had reached production deployment on several networks by late 2023. These architectures could not be disabled by a founder's detention because they required no founder's ongoing cooperation. The proofs were generated and verified by the mathematics of the cryptographic system, not by the authorization of any individual. The trade-offs were real. ZK bridges were computationally expensive, had higher latency than trusted bridges, and were limited to the granular proof systems they were built on. But the security properties they offered were qualitatively superior to anything that relied on human key management. The ecosystem also absorbed a subtler lesson about the relationship between product complexity and organizational resilience. Multi-chain had been technically sophisticated. Its MPC node network was a genuine advance over naive single-key management. but its organizational structure had not matched its technical sophistication. Building technically complex infrastructure requires not just the ability to design and deploy that infrastructure, but the organizational depth to manage it when the lead developer is unavailable. The protocols that emerged from the post-multi-chain period with the strongest reputations for bridge security were those that had not just improved their technical architecture, but had built operational teams that distributed key management knowledge and responsibilities across multiple qualified individuals. The multi-chain story has not fully resolved. As of 2024, the full accounting of what happened to the drained funds, how much was seized by Chinese authorities, how much remained with Zhaojun or associated parties, and what the prospects were for any recovery by affected users, remained unclear. The Chinese legal proceedings were not public in ways that would allow independent assessment. The wallets that had received the drained funds were on-chain and trackable, but the people or entities controlling them had not been publicly identified. The case sits in the particular limbo that several major DeFi failures have occupied. Substantial losses, uncertain attribution, partial explanations from interested parties, limited legal recourse, and a permanent on-chain record that tells you exactly what happened to the money, but not exactly who directed it to happen. For the DeFi community, the residual significance of multi-chain is primarily architectural. The case demonstrated a failure mode that the community has now taken seriously in a way it had not before. The intersection of centralized key management and jurisdictional risk, in a world where many DeFi protocols with global users are built by founders in China or other countries with active cryptocurrency enforcement regimes. The broader question that multi-chain raises about the risks created when critical financial infrastructure is built by individuals in jurisdictions where the regulatory environment is unpredictable and where government action can disable key management without notice does not have an easy answer. The talent and capital that have flowed into DeFi from China have been genuinely important contributions to the ecosystem. The risk that comes with that contribution, the possibility that founders and operators can be detained by authorities in ways that disable the systems they control, is a real risk that the ecosystem has only recently begun to take seriously. The answer is not to exclude participation from any jurisdiction. That would be both impractical and contrary to the decentralized spirit of the space. The answer is architectural. To build infrastructure that does not fail when any individual fails, that distributes its key management and governance broadly enough that no single detention or disappearance can strand hundreds of millions of dollars. This is technically achievable. Whether it will become the standard implemented at scale across DeFi's bridge infrastructure remains to be seen. What would a resolved multi-chain case actually look like? The question is harder to answer than it might seem. Partial recovery of drained funds through legal proceedings in China would provide something, but would not fully compensate the affected users. A detailed public accounting of what happened, who directed the fund movements, under what circumstances, and with what authorization, would provide closure of a kind, but would not return the money. The precedent value of a clear determination about the legal status of the Chinese authorities' involvement, whether seizing assets from a DeFi protocol bridge constitutes a lawful government action and under what law, would have long-term implications for how similar future situations are handled. None of these outcomes were clearly forthcoming as of the time of this account. The multi-chain case joins a particular category of DeFi events where the full story remains inaccessible behind jurisdictional barriers, uncertain attribution, and the opacity of proceedings that do not produce publicly accessible records. The Bitfinex hack of 2016, whose funds remained unrecovered for 5 years before being seized, demonstrated that blockchain forensics eventually catches up with on-chain evidence. But the Bitfinex case involved no government custody dimension. The keys were held by private actors who could eventually be identified and prosecuted. Multichain's intersection with Chinese government enforcement actions creates a layer of complexity that purely forensic analysis cannot resolve. The multi-chain team members who were not detained, developers and operational staff who had been involved with the protocol but did not hold the critical keys, found themselves in a difficult position after the collapse. They were associated with a protocol that had failed in a way that destroyed user funds. They did not have the ability to fix the situation. They were not the cause of the failure. The attribution of responsibility in a protocol collapse that resulted from government action rather than technical failure or fraud does not map cleanly onto the frameworks the DeFi community had developed for thinking about accountability. The discussion in DeFi communities about the multi-chain team's responsibility tended to oscillate between empathy for people who had been caught in a legal situation outside their control and frustration that the architectural decisions made before the crisis had created so much preventable risk. For many users, the practical resolution was simple, if unsatisfying. They moved to other bridges, the funds they had lost became a cost they absorbed, and they applied the multi-chain lesson by demanding better key management transparency from the infrastructure they used going forward. The collective memory of DeFi is short. New protocols and new opportunities continuously displace attention from past failures. But the multi-chain case had been concrete enough, with enough affected users across enough protocol ecosystems, to leave a lasting mark on the community's expectations of bridge security. There is a kind of infrastructure vulnerability that is only visible after it has triggered. Before the failure, the system works. Transactions clear, assets arrive, users accumulate confidence in the system's reliability. That confidence is not irrational. It is evidence-based, grounded in the record of previous correct behavior. The failure, when it comes, is not a correction of that confidence, but an exposure of a risk that the prior record had never tested. Multichain's 3 years of successful operation were real. Its value to the DeFi ecosystem was real. The trust that users had developed in it was grounded in genuine observed reliability. What the 3 years of success could not demonstrate was how the system would behave when the concrete failure mode it contained, key management dependency on a small number of individuals in a high enforcement jurisdiction, was finally activated. The DeFi ecosystem's response to that activation, imperfect as it was, represented a genuine process of learning. Architectural standards improved, transparency requirements increased. The vocabulary of bridge risk, multi-sig thresholds, jurisdictional distribution, ZK versus trusted models, became part of the evaluative toolkit that informed users and protocol teams applied when assessing bridge infrastructure. That the learning was expensive does not make it less real. The multi-chain collapse paid a tuition that the ecosystem has been, however unevenly, applying. Close your eyes again if they have drifted open in the night. The multi-chain bridge contracts are still on-chain. The code is still deployed to the Ethereum, Phantom, and other blockchain networks where it was installed, running silently, holding whatever assets were not drained during the collapse. The on-chain record of every transaction is still there. The years of normal operation, the sudden silence in May 2023, the irregular outflows through July, the frozen state that followed. It is a record of 3 years of genuine utility and one catastrophic failure, preserved permanently in the same immutable ledger that records every other transaction in the history of those networks. Somewhere in China, Zhaojun's story is still unfolding, in a legal proceeding that is not publicly documented, in circumstances that are not publicly known. He built something that millions of people used. He held the keys to something that hundreds of millions of dollars depended on. What happened to those keys, and to him, and to the money, is a story that may never be fully told. Let the uncertainty rest alongside you tonight. Not all stories have clean endings. Not all questions have answers that are findable from where we stand. You are safe. You are still. Rest. Story end.